This is FUNCRECOL light curing putty. So this is a UV cured putty that's typically used for filling in holes or fixing things on a UV cured resin print, although you can use it with non-resin items. So this is essentially a 50-gram container, and it uses 365 to 405 nanometer UV light to cure. So if you're using this indoors to cure it, you would either have a little UV flashlight, or you would have to take your workpiece outside and expose it to the sun. You definitely don't want to use this outside, because if the sunlight hits it, it'll start curing immediately. I was sent this to review for free. If you wanted to purchase it, it would cost you $25. I'm going to use this to try filling in some gaps on some 3D printed models where they're printed in multiple parts, the parts snap together, but this will leave some gaps between them in some cases. And so I'm going to be filling those gaps with this putty and then curing it to make a smooth surface across those gaps. So in addition to the packaging and the tin of putty itself, you get a small applicator here. You will want to have your own gloves, either vinyl or latex gloves, when working with this, unless you're very careful and use only the applicator and never touch it with your fingers. So this little guy was printed in two pieces. The tail portion is separate from the main body portion, and there's some definite cracks and gaps visible around most of that. So I'm going to be putting putty inside of these cracks and gaps to fill that. So the lid screws off pretty easily. There is a smell. You can definitely smell that there is some kind of a chemical smell coming out of this. It is a pretty thick putty, so it is not going to run or move around after you put it in place. And it's, you have to dig into it to get it out of the pot. So supposedly, you'll have infinite working time as long as you don't hit it with UV light. So that's nice, not having to hurry. Now obviously, you don't want to leave it out exposed to the air for super long times, but while you're working with it, it's fine to just leave it sitting out here. I'm getting putty in places other than this crack, partially because it's a super fine crack, and partially because the putty comes off in kind of big chunks. And so this stick they provide is good for getting it pushed into the crack, but I'm definitely going to have to go over this with a finger and smooth out around the crack after I get the putty stuffed into the crack. Okay, I feel like I have enough putty in place, and now I'm going to try to remove putty. I'm just hitting it with my vinyl gloves, and it's kind of sticking to the vinyl glove there. Because this is a small area, I might have to get a tool like a Q-tip to go into some of these spots, but just my fingers is doing a pretty good job. We are definitely going to put the lid on before we turn on our ultraviolet flashlights. So this guy here says between 365 and 405 nanometers. So it should work with a standard 365 nanometer flashlight. I also have a flashlight that's 365 and 395. So if it doesn't solidify with just the 365, we can hit it with something a little bit higher. And I am going to take a piece here and just leave it on the paper towel there to try it out with. Okay, so we've sealed this off so the ultraviolet light will not hit that. And we're just going to hit this with a flashlight here. So I'm hitting it with 365 nanometers right now. And that feels kind of rock hard right now, actually. Let me see Yeah, that's definitely hardened up pretty quickly there. So it looks like 365 is just fine if you don't have a 400 nanometer, or a 395 nanometer. The 365 nanometer, just a small LED flashlight style is working just fine. And of course, if you don't have an ultraviolet flashlight, you can always just take this out into the sun. And as soon as it hits the sunlight, that thing's going to turn solid. So it's more of a translucent color than a white, and so I can still see where it is and where the gap is, but it has filled in the gap. Now, what was on my gloves is mostly hardened up, but there's a few places where it's still sticky. It wasn't getting direct ultraviolet light, so if I were to shine this directly on the stuff on my gloves, I'm pretty sure it would solid up pretty quickly there. Yeah, so those feel hard now. All right, that's how you use it. Now the putty did build up the seam a little bit, and so after I've done that, I'm going to hit it with a file to basically knock down the parts that are sticking up. And some of that is the 3D model had kind of a seam that sticks up right there, but the putty filled in the gap between the two parts just fine. And now I'm just trying to smooth out the seam between the two parts so that when I paint it with a base coat, it will be less obvious that there's a seam between those two parts. All right, just did about 3 minutes of filing on that. And so the seam here is now pretty smooth as I go across. I was filing away both the putty and a little bit of the 3D printed resin of the figurine itself, kind of, whichever was high there to make things kind of go across there. So I'm going to give this thing a base coat of paint, and then I expect that seam will be, if you look for it, you'll probably be able to tell where it is, but most of it's on the bottom here. So I think once it's painted, you really won't be able to see it, especially on the top up on this side. All right, I'm getting close to being finished painting this guy. And as you can see here, once you put the paint on, you really can't see that seam there. It's very unnoticeable once you have the texture on the paint. All right, so in summary, the FUNCRECOL light curing putty was pretty easy to use. It hardens up really quickly. You just hit it with the UV light. You will have to invest in UV light if you want to use it during the night. In the daytime, you can just take whatever you have outside and the sun will cure it really fast as well. Once it's cured, you can work it with a file or sandpaper to get it to any shape you want. And then you just paint over it and it holds the paint really well.